Take it away, Paul.
All right. Good evening. My name is Paul Bauknight. I'm a Northside resident. I live over in the Willard Hay neighborhood at 16th and Vincent. I'm an architect by training, and I've spent close to 30 years working on the North Side on a variety of projects. I'm an urbanist. My day job is I'm the project implementation director at the Minneapolis Parks Foundation. I'm also a fellow at the Minnesota Design Center. I'm a board member at Friends of the Mississippi River. As Kelly said, I used to be involved in co-creation heavily in the beginning, and I've pretty much been tracking the Upper Harbor project since the RFQ came out, and I was also at Urban Homeworks as their director of urban placemaking. My history is all urban redevelopment, a lot of housing in my early days, Plymouth Avenue townhouses. I worked on Heritage Park, Lovell Square. I did the Urban League headquarters building, PCYC, Seed Academy. So I have a kind of a deep history on the North Side. My real interests lie in this connection between social, economic, physical, and cultural. So I have pretty much of a different take than most architects on how this work comes about and where it should go. It's really from a very strong emphasis on people and their needs and connections. I also spent some time as the director of the African American Men Project at Hennepin County at North Point. So I encourage all architects to work in a social service agency if they want to really understand how to work in an urban community, because you get learn the whole thing that it's about the people, it's not about the buildings. So today I'm going to talk about ownership models, and if any of you are at the learning table where I talked about ownership models, you may hear some of the same things. If you weren't, it'll be all new. So really, I like to think about ownership from two perspectives, and I gave you just some brief handouts. One, the one sort of Excel sheet is thinking about ownership from two vantage points. One, ownership where the community controls the process, so the total process from vision to implementation, along with then what's the results of that. So, if you're thinking and dreaming and designing the process and the project, what are your results? What are your results from that? So this sheet comes from a great book by a woman named Jennifer Vanica called Courageous Philanthropy. And she was the executive director of the Jacobs Foundation. And for you guys who are engineers, that is Jacobs Engineering. And they developed a project called Market Creek Plaza in San Diego, which is a IPO, 40 acres in the Diamond District. And that was back in like 2006. So her book is really the chronicle of how they got from idea to reality at Market Creek. The second sheet is something that's relatively new. It's a document from a plan that you can get online, actually, called, what the heck is it called? Towards a New System of Community Wealth. And that is really talking about how do we get to community wealth? What does it take to get to community wealth? And really, why we want to talk about ownership and community wealth is because we want to get away from the traditional processes, which are really top-down processes about here's what you should do. And so most of those community development processes are really come out of fair housing, the civil rights movement, a reaction to redlining and all that. A lot of it is anchored in the federal government, but really it's still a totally top-down system of here's how you do this, because mostly it's driven by the programs and the dollars that are connected to it. To where we have a bottom-up system, and we want a cross-sector approach where we're really thinking about how we build people, not buildings. So we really want to think about places like this, entrepreneurship. We want to think about housing, but not only housing. We want to think about home ownership. We want to think about home ownership from how do we get people to have wealth so they can actually buy a house, not just how do we do home ownership where where we're subsidizing down the number, because really that's not building wealth in the community. So how do we think about that? How do we think about systems and processes that are in place that prevent us from doing that kind of work? So what this sheet does is talks about the old system and the new system in terms of building community wealth. A couple quick important ones that I really like. The two-pocket capital versus one-pocket capital. So basically, two pockets where, a business says, we make money and we think about how we can give to philanthropy, charity, whatever, and that's going to make a difference, even though sometimes those are totally at cross purposes. Or getting to one pocket where it's like, okay, we're thinking about these together in a system, and profit and philanthropy are together working on how do we do this work together. And the three critical things that I always talk about, and when you're thinking about ownership in these projects, is one, it's got to be totally community centered. So like I said, it's bottom up. So it's not, we have an idea, what do you think? It's never that. It's never that, right? Two, it's holistic. So like I said, we're cutting across sectors and we're understanding what's going on in the community, what are their needs, and how does that drive opportunities for what we should do. And three, time, okay? None of these happen in a short time frame. So if you look at any of the projects, the third sheet I gave you is a whole list of information, places you can go where you can read about all of this stuff. If you're really geeky like me, you'll have a blast. If you're not, you'll go I don't want to do this. But some of the examples of projects that are either undertaking this or have done it. Everyone talks about the 11th Street Bridge project. That's in Washington, D.C. It's on the Anacostia River, and it's really about connecting two communities across the river, building a new bridge on some bridge abutments because the old bridge had failed. The real importance about that project is it's really all about how the community drives what they want, how they spent 3 years talking about where they should go before they did any design, how they have a total equity plan, and it's not an equitable development plan where we have a checklist that we say, oh, did the developer do this? Because when you get to did the developer did this, you're already past equity, right? Because the power is already at the developer, right? And the other part of that is when we talk about real estate, we have to be really honest. The process of real estate development is not equitable because it's about how do you make money by commoditizing the land. And it's about how do you make money for the few, right? So we just have to be honest about that. Doesn't mean that we're not going to have real estate development, but it means we have to think about how do you use it, right? And it doesn't matter if you're a white real estate developer, a black real estate developer, a woman or man. If you're going to use the traditional capital system to develop something, you're in that process. Right? You can't get out of it, right? So we have to remember that as we go. And so if you start there, it's really hard to say, oh, we're going to do equity, because basically you're trying to like put equity on top of the cake. So the ownership developments I like to talk about, like I said, 11th Street Bridge, because I think it's really a model right now that is really diving into how do we use a project to advance needs in the community, and how does the community really have control of that. Market Creek Plaza, because it's a real ownership model where the community could buy shares and where they raised equity and they have a stake. And it was a process that really started from the community saying, we have this abandoned factory. It's a detriment in our community. What do we do? It evolved into, well, it's a grocery store, but it's even more than that. And that whole process of getting there. And then the other one that I talk about a lot is in Boston, the Dudley Street project, which is a long history of owning property within Roxbury and that process. But there's a lot of work going on. I think the emerging ownership and wealth building sort of process is really coming out of people saying, okay, we've done all this work, we've built a lot of buildings, we've done a lot of programs, and we keep looking around and the disparities and the issues don't change. So if we're going to do this, we have to think about it differently. And we have to realize that, none of this exists in a silo. It doesn't exist separately. And we have to work across. And we also have to acknowledge that we didn't get there accidentally, that things that go on in the community, the impacts are the result of racism and institutionalized racism and processes that have made communities have these problems, whether it's putting a highway through the middle of it, whether it's redlining, whether it's deciding you get all the polluting industry on your end of town because you don't have the power to say no, whether it's number one. But these don't happen by a fluke. You're constantly trying to do that, along with things like education. So you have to like work on all those at the same time. So if you want to bring coloplast to the river, I'm gonna get in trouble. If you want to bring coloplast to the river and you want to say that's going to be a job generator, then what you have to look at is, well, how many people in North Minneapolis have the skill set to work at coloplast beyond the factory side? So, there's a lot of good jobs at coloplast, but, their master's degree, whatever, right? So you have to think about that way early. Way early. So what's your strategy to do that work early on so that people have the opportunity then to get those jobs? And I think that's really important because, jobs just don't show up. They're here, companies come for a reason, right? So really ownership is really about vision, who creates it, who owns it, who implements it. Then how do those same people, community, how do they benefit? So it's thinking about all of that at the same time and working that together and dealing with the challenges of, you're going to have some things that are great that go together and you're going to have some things that clash. And so you really need an integrated process to work on that. And the resource development and the training and all of that work needs to be going on before really you start talking about what happens on the site. And then it goes alongside and really it drives what you do on the site. So I'm going to stop there because I think I'm getting to my 10 minutes. I'm going to let people ask questions. Bill.
How do urban planners define ownership? And by that I mean, you can conceive that there's community ownership, publicly owned development. So are we talking a pure definition of estimate ownership, or does it go beyond?
I think it.
And can you repeat that?
Okay, sure. The question was, how do urban designers define ownership? And is it a definition about public ownership? Is it community ownership? Is it financial ownership? Did I get most of that?
Yeah.
Okay. So to be honest, for the most part, urban designers have not focused on ownership. So there hasn't been a big, in the urban design profession, this questioning about, okay, we're doing this work, we're figuring out, what land uses are and what goes where. Owner, really not. So now, as though this has become a rising concern, and it's become a rising concern because ownership was not defined as where we're doing urban design, the people that are going to interact with that, benefit from it, have some ownership in why should we do it or not, how do we do it, and where do we benefit. And I think then you, depending on what's going on and depending on the community, there can be a variety of what are the benefits. It may be in terms of a road, right? Because we don't own the road, but we can have ownership of why the road goes where it goes, what's alongside the road, do we have parking on the road or not? Does it, there's a lot of things that go along with streets. So there's an ownership, there could be an ownership mechanism in that. If we get to commercial development, then that's a different conversation about, okay, one, are we going to have a conversation about what do we need in the community? What are the resources and opportunities that are already in the community that can go in that commercial space without having to go out to national, players who are only extracting money? That money is not going to stay in the community. If it's a dollar store, that money is leaving. If it's do rules, that money stays there. So as we think about, well, what are the talents, resources, assets in the community, then we can start to say, well, what should we do there? Yeah, we can get down to we actually own it financially, and there's a variety of ways that can be. That can be direct. Yes, I bought a share in it. That could be direct. I own the house. So I think there's a wide variety, but that has to be somebody saying in the beginning, we're going to tackle those questions. So, when I was in architecture school, no one ever talked about ownership, ever. I mean, that never happened. Those social concerns never came up when I was in architecture school.
So maybe you just think you started to talk about this now, but thinking about jobs and how the city just had an event last Monday where the jobs were all about businesses that would support First Avenue, essentially. That's what it said on their website, right? Businesses that would essentially help benefit the music venue, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when we were doing the co-creation team, we were looking at businesses like solar businesses, because we have local businesses that are solar and the utility hub and that kind of thing. So I guess I'm kind of curious, like, where would you recommend going in terms of jobs? Oh, and at the CPC, we also had Coca-Cola Company come up and other industrial buildings. So I'm not quite sure how you synthesize that to repeat it, but I'm kind of curious, just what would you recommend as far as how we bring community demand and what we actually need there in terms of the community?
Through like an ownership lens, some sort of determination.
So the question is, how do we look at job creation through an ownership lens across the variety of market opportunities that could be out there?
Sure.
Okay. So first, I think remembers, the community always knows best. So the community always knows best. I think second is, and I started that, is to understand that there are natural markets here, there are strengths here, there are skill sets here, there are assets, and can you tap into those in terms of creating business opportunities? Also, existing entrepreneurs and people working, how do we support them and grow them so that they have an opportunity to grow their businesses, to hire other people in the community, do whatever. I think in terms of businesses that are existing or coming in, I think first for me, I always ask the question is it a living wage job? That's number one on my list. We know that, when we look at major growth, a lot of it's in the service industries, which are not living wage jobs. But that's like, just the other day, there was, talk about the economy and the growth of jobs, and, and the number was better than expected, but the majority of it was in the service industry. So, retail is not a living wage job. So I want to think about, well, where are living wage jobs? First, is whatever you could have some kind of, if it's some kind of factory, is there a real market here? Is it living wage? Is there laddering where people can move up? What's their track record? Frankly, are we not, throwing a lot of tax dollar subsidies at them to get them to move from one place to the other, where it's kind of like, okay, why are we paying them to show up here? And also really critical of how does that fit in the existing ecosystem that we have here? What are the opportunities? Is it cutting edge? All of those things I think you have to do. So we've had for a long time, there's been this idea that, okay, we just need jobs. So whatever shows up that has numbers, that must be good. Well, that's been proven it doesn't work. You can look across the country and go, that strategy does not work. Okay, so how do you do it differently? And a lot of that has to do with being honest about Two, who's in the community? Where are they? Like I said, I talked about training. So, your school's got to get better because people come and they say, well, who's your workforce? And do they have the ability? Or can we train them? So, how do we credential people so then that gets into technical college, whatever, So I think it's all that, but you have to have a real strategy to produce real living wage jobs and have them stay and have it work. And you just can't be casting about hoping that that'll work. And we know that, that I don't care whether it's the Twin Stadium, the Viking Stadium, the Target Center, none of those, and nowhere in the country have they ever created the economic impact that they claim. But we keep, for whatever reason, giving them money, even though every study says no, they don't work, right? So part-time, minimum wage jobs don't work. The hospitality industry, really, come on. We all know what the hospitality industry is, so the difficulty. So I think we have the ability to, we have the ability here in this city. We have the intelligence, we have the resources, to figure this out in a way that works. We've got the we have a lot of smart people. We have an incredible philanthropic infrastructure here. We have the ability to do this, but it would take saying, okay, we have to bring all that together and think about it in a way that drives this, right? And then says, okay, understanding all that, understanding what are the resources in the community, then what should we do on the site that enhances that and gives people opportunity? And that might be a bottling plant. I don't know, but until someone shows me that works, just throwing that out is not a good use of time.
So,
Tom.
Tom, Bill, David.
So I'd like to briefly, you're on the park board. You're involved with the
I'm on the foundation board, not the park board.
foundation board,
Yeah.
right? And you've been involved with this planning with the youth.
I have.
Okay. That there is a profound difference. The park board tends to do bottom-up community involvement in what happens in parks. City, the standard method that they're talking about is the top-down, outside looking in. That does not bode well for the Upper Harbor project. Number one, related to that, one who's dealing with housing or anything else, there is the immediate solution, which is securing jobs, building houses, and things like that. Then there's second, third, and fourth generation. The only way that I can see UHT survive beyond that initial part is if the land is either owned by the city on 99 rolling lease or goes into a land trust, because land appreciates, as you know, and buildings depreciate. There is no talk anywhere about that land, and you mentioned Dudley.
Mm-hmm.
Dudley is the land ownership.
Right.
CLCLT is ownership, different model, for purpose, and now public banking is down at the level of community taking it over. That's Bernie Sanders versus XYZ. So given the practicalities of UHT, what is, with the current model, what is your assessment of the hope that any of this stuff we're talking about with community involvement, eco harbor, a bottom-up planning, seems to me has gone, unless something happens and there's a dynamite dropped in the middle of planning offices, and they have to replace all the mentalities.
So we're going to recap what he's saying, and you're going to comment on a community-based
Okay.
ownership model. Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
So the question is, how do we look at the Upper Harbor development from a community-based ownership model? And given the current state of affairs, how do we see that happening?
And can you recap, like, who's going to own what and when?
Sure. So first of all, right now, you're right. The engagement model has been more top down. I will say that I've been involved in a lot of large projects in this city and in this neighborhood, and this city has the ability to do a better engagement process than we've seen to date. All right. So I'm going to leave that at that. I've been there, so I know I've been there. All right. So I would agree. I agree that the ownership of land is critical in the determination and in the ability to make a difference on the ownership model. Unfortunately, the city has opted for we're going to sell the land to a developer and really look at this as a traditional real estate development project. That's sad because the fact of the matter is, the city does own the land, so the opportunity to think about a different model is there. So yes, ultimately, some kind of trust, whichever way you want to look at it. I mean, a land trust, a neighborhood trust, an investment model like Market Creek where people have ownership, yes, would be what I would want to see, where the community owns the land and it has that asset. And as we all know, land appreciates and buildings depreciate. So yes, that would be my preferred strategy. I don't know if all 48 acres have to be in that model. I don't think so, and I also think that would be extremely difficult. I mean, there isn't a residential land trust, maybe in aggregate, maybe 48 acres. There's not a commercial land trust that large out there because of the differences in how commercial building ownership works versus a residential ownership. So commercial land trusts are a lot harder. There's a really good report on commercial land trusts on the 11th Street Bridge website. They had a study done by Virginia Tech. I have to brag, that's my alma mater. But so there is this research out there, and even CLCT is looking at the commercial land trust model. I am an optimist. I think Michelle and Kelly know I'm an optimist. I have not given up on the fact that I think there's still an opportunity out there at Upper Harbor. I've been through enough large projects like Heritage Park, which went through a lot of turmoil to before it got going. So I still think there's an opportunity. It will take sustained community engagement. As people ask, well, who should we talk to? Like, you could talk to your council member, whatever. But I haven't given up yet. I mean, they haven't signed the land. They haven't sold the land yet. The land has not been sold yet to the developer. So I think there's still opportunity. But I am concerned, like you are, about how do we get there, because not just the ownership piece, but the whole strategy for about what do you do? I mean, how do you do that, right? Because it's not worked out, and there isn't a mechanism really in place to own significant amount of land at the Upper Harbor site. So you'd have to develop that. You need an entity. There's a lot of work involved in doing that, and that's work that we should have been doing 2 years ago if you really want to get there. So it's going to be difficult to do that. Or yes, you could do the lease model, but the big issue is Right now, the city does not want to be in any of those relationships. The city wants to sell the land. That's what they want to do. They want to sell the land, get it developed. You know, that's and so there's a struggle there in terms of how do you move this.
The city has a dilemma because they're going to float bonds.
It's 6 o'clock.
Part of those bonds are going to own the amphitheater, which means they're back in the same position they are with the Target Center. And ownership, neither First Avenue nor UP is going to be responsible for those bonds.
So the question is, the city won't be totally out of the ownership situation because they're going to use whatever bonds from the state to the $20 million to help finance the amphitheater. Now, my understanding from all of the CPC meetings I've been to is that the city has said we do not want to own the amphitheater and we don't want to be in the situation we're at the Target Center. Now, I don't know how that will all shake out, but that has been their mantra at the meetings that we don't want to own. We don't want to own it. So I don't know how they're going to figure that out because it's not like the parking garage at the Walker where it's a nonprofit that then owns the building. So I don't know how that's going to work, but they have said they don't want to own that. So we'll have to wait and see how that goes with the bonds. So I don't know. That's for a whole lot of lawyers.
Bill and David, and then John, and then Michelle.
Yeah, and my comment is more brief because a lot of that was addressed in the last discussion. Yeah, I guess process. The academic sources have process defined because we've talked about wealth has to be defined by the community, by the stakeholders. Then so very early in the process, as we talk about it with Upper Harbor, there needed to have been, or should be, a definition of wealth building. What does that mean? So, I'm sure one could come up with 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 steps. Has that been done? Is there
So the question is the process of ownership and wealth building been defined, and are there processes and models out there? So the answer is yes. So if you go to 11th Street Bridge, you can look at all of their information. It shows their process. If you go to Market Creek Plaza, you can look at their process. If you go to the Democracy Collaborative and look at their whole wealth building section, they have a whole process that they outline. So there's a lot of information out there about process. The caveat there is you always adjust it for your context and your place, right? But there's a lot of really good work that's already been done on how you think about this and what's critical and how you can look at it. And here's what we did. And in some places where, they've like at Market Creek where it's built, there's even, okay, this is what worked and this is what didn't work. So yes, there's plenty of information out there on this that, you can access and use as a way. And we even have here, there's a partnership between the University of Minnesota and the Minnesota AIA, American Institute of Architects, called 21st Century Development, which is, right, so that. So that's right here in town. That's right here in town. That has a whole process laid out, including a very significant equity portion. That was developed by a guy named Brian Lee from New Orleans called Co-Locate. So really, the information is here. It's not that we don't have the information or the ability or really anything. I mean, will is another question. Do we have the will to say, okay, this 48 acres on the river, critical, not only for the north side, but really in terms of thinking about how we think about development along the river as other industrial properties and things, start to turn over. people are gonna look and say, well, what did they do at Upper Harbor? What did they do with that 48 acres that's up there that got developed? Like, can we pattern what we're gonna do after what they did? So it's not only about, Upper Harbor, it's about, the stretch, and if we're watching what's happening with development along the river. What we're continuing to see is luxury housing kind of marching its way up. So now we have that development right on the corner of Plymouth and West River Road. All right, so we have that. I keep hearing things like, okay, Broadway Pizza is gonna get bought and something's gonna happen there. So we're gonna continue to see that kind of stuff, and then that pressure will then push into industrial lands. And I mean, it's not going to be overnight, but remember, it wasn't that long ago that the Central Riverfront was all industry. That's not long ago. How long is that, John?
That's 40 years.
Yeah. So it's not. We're not talking long before that could be totally different. So, okay, who's next?
David.
So, according to what I've heard so far, the first job is to stop the sale. Stop the sale. Along with informing the community that we have land on the river that was appropriated by the Europeans that came here and the people that lived here. And now it's going to be appropriated again by the buyer of 48 acres of public land, which is public land. We don't have to buy it, it's ours. So I think it's up to us to decide what happens with it. The term development is kind of problematic. I kind of like undevelopment myself. It seems like we don't have to do 48-acre project. We can do a housing project, and we can do a park project. And the park remains public land or restored riverfront.
But the park now has approximately 20 acres of those 48 acres.
Correct.
Right along the line has not been drawn between the city's owned land and what the park board gets. So that whole segment of 20 acres along the river, our park board will be the park board foundation, or whoever has the ownership, much as Bloom Island and the other. That will be a trust. That's a land trust that the park board has. So those 20 acres are off the UHT development site. That's the park board's role in doing.
Well, it's an integrated plan.
So
20 acres with a
all
hotel.
some of the members of the park board, they are, the minute that line gets drawn, they've got $6 million sitting in the bank. They have their own planning agencies, and they're on their way to develop that as they go. And what happens on the other 30-some-odd acres is not of their concern, at least from some of the members that are on the park board right now.
And with David's too, he called this public land, and we've also called it city-owned land. Are those interchangeable?
Well, city-owned land is public land because we pay
Right.
for it. We're so yes. So I want to address your comments, which were about stopping the sale, undevelopment, and basically community involvement, right? I'm going to start with community. So I think even though Upper Harbor has been out here for a long time, there's still not know what is going on in Upper Harbor, and that's because we all have a whole lot of things we're not paying attention. I think another witness this is that helping community understand too that something that doesn't necessarily mean it's good. So not getting seduced by the objects is really important, because in communities of color, disadvantaged communities, there's a tendency to say, oh, look, they're going to build something that's great because we other people have it and we don't, so it must be better than this land being empty, right? Which really feeds into the whole idea that, land should always be made into making more money. So part of our work in ownership and wealth building is really helping, is really getting the community to understand, okay, what should we do and why, and how do we benefit from if we build something, but just building something necessarily isn't always the answer. You're absolutely right. Community, has to, if this is going to change, they have to be the change agents. I mean, that's the bottom line. It's the only way it's going to happen is community has to be the change agents.
Who's gonna build the cat?
Who's going to build the what?
Who's gonna build the cat?
Let's get back to that a little bit later. Don, Michelle, Melissa, then back to Tom.
So Paul, I think you kind of hinted at it already, but I've heard some good presentations on scenario planning where you have a community sits down and says, okay, let's play out this plan of the way it's proposed right now. Let's come up with a different arrangement. Let's play that out and see where it takes us. And you give the community a number of options to play out. And at the end, they say, okay, this is the way, that combination of that thing is the way we see it playing out for us. Is that a possibility, or does it work in your experience?
So I have not been involved directly in any scenario planning like that. Okay. But, I lean towards it's not about the scenario, but it's really about how the community drives whatever scenarios go on the table, right? So there may be three, but they're driven by the community, right? So yeah. So it could be this is one, this is two, this is three. But actually, I think if community is really driving it, what you get is an evolution, and you don't get these A, B, C. I think you get a evolution of we started here, we thought about this, and we did this, and then this, then we didn't even know this existed until we spent time talking about it, and then all of a sudden, what's that? And then that gets in there, and then just like in the design process, it's iterative, and it goes back and forth sometimes, but it's an evolution, and you may have distinct ideas or scenarios within that, but you're evolving. That's a really, most people hate that. Most people like to say, can you show me something that I can react to? And they don't like you to say to them, I don't want to do that. I want you to help me create this. So even being in the CAC, people are saying, can you show some designs? Right? Because people love to say, oh, here, do you like this or not? And it's hard to not do that and to really dig into what should a park be in North Minneapolis on the river in 2020, right? That's a question you should ask, right? How do you think about connection, healing, culture? Like, those are the questions you should ask, and then that should drive what you get, right? That's a totally different process than going, well, how do we want to program it for who shows up? And I think the thing we also got to remember is, that site is so disconnected from the community. I mean, we tend to think, yeah, here it is, and it's so close. It's not close. It's not close at all. I mean, not only is the highway in the way, but the industry and stuff is in the way. So, the Trust for Public Land recommends that everybody should be within a 10-minute walk of a park. That's kind of the gold standard. And a lot of places in Minneapolis, that's true. If you take 10 minutes from the Upper Harbor into the community, you know where you end up? You're right on the edge. You're right on the edge of the highway. So really, most of the community is outside of that 10-minute walk. And there's more about who's inside that 10-minute walk And if you think about, like Washington and 2nd Street, and it's kind of funky there, but that's one of my big worries is, will you get all this development sort of in that zone that will become sort of its own community, disconnected from the north side because of that reality? Because even though you can walk all the way or bike all the way down 26 to get to where we're going to do the overlook project, once you get on the other side of the highway, it's not a nice walk or bike ride. I mean, yes, it's going to be a connection. Yes, it's really important because the north side doesn't have a connection really directly to the river. But if you think about all our connections to the river, Broadway, Plymouth, Lowry, none of them are really nice walking or biking. And once you get there, Plymouth is better because you got Bloom Island. Plymouth is actually better, but like Lowry, what do you got? You got GAF. I mean, so you have all this industry that's in between, and so we're not thinking yet about what does that look like. So, I digressed a little bit, but that's a big concern of mine.
So you go to these meetings, the CAC, the CPC, the learning tables, and they're still dominated in the audience by the developers and the consultants. There aren't that many community members there. And when we were out as the co-creation team last January, preparing for the concept plan vote, we talked with about 100 people in the community. McKinley, Inley, I believe we were out and about. And none of them have been contacted about what was taking place at Upper Harbor Terminal. And so I think about now what the difference is and how many more people actually know about what's going on. I don't know if there's much more difference as far as people's knowledge. And I think about those of us who are in this room now. We have some people from Minneapolis, we have some people from Northeast and different places. I'm wondering what you recommend, Paul, in regards to getting the word out to other Northsiders, like what each individual here can do to let people know.
So the question is, how can we connect more deeply and authentically to Northside residents? What can people in this room do to help that, and how can that influence the process that we have? Okay. So one, I think, everybody, if you're a Northsider, you should tell your neighbor, you need to go to this meeting. You need to show up. And if you're at wherever you're at, where there are Northsiders gathered, you say you need to come to these meetings. They're really important. You need to show up because we don't have critical mass in those rooms. Two, though, always asking people to go to meetings is not the best way. So going to where people are is much better way. So how do you connect to people where they're at? Because they're busy and they don't have time like us professional meeting goers to go to meetings every night. As my mother says to me, is that all you do? You go to meetings? Like, yeah, that's pretty much what I do. I go to meetings a lot. So how do we get to people where they're at? Wherever that is. Is that at mosque? Is that at church? Is that at school? Is that at athletic events? Where are people? So how do we go get there, right? That's a different strategy. It requires thinking about it differently. It requires not saying, well, I really want to engage you around what we're already thinking, right? And I think that's a critical difference. And I've done that, and people have been mad at me saying, you're the architect. Why are you not showing me any pictures? Like, we're tired of you asking us questions, Paul. But at the end of the day, it's like, no, I'm getting you engaged, and I'm probing. So, because we're starting from, I don't know, and as a community, 100%, Sometimes getting that out is a little bumpy, but all community processes are bumpy and have issues and take time. They all do. I don't care where you're at. It's not just here. You know, if you want to do a land bridge over 94, no, it wasn't 94. If you want to do a land bridge in Edina over 100, you have a very ugly community process. So, no different than what we see going on here, right? So all community process is challenging, right? Because it's hard to get people together and
Speak to
figure out.
Rondo, then.
Yeah. Speak to Rondo?
Right.
I think Rondo right now has had Rondo started from community. That's the difference. I mean, Rondo is about community saying, we want to do this and driving the process. Rondo is not about, a developer, the city, whoever coming and saying, hey, we want to do a land bridge here. It's about people in Rondo saying, we want to do a land bridge to right the wrong that was done by 94 plowing through our community and to make a difference. And so that changes the whole dynamics of that process. But I guarantee you, if I go into Rondo, I can find people who will not be happy about the process. I guarantee you that, because in every process, there are people who are not happy, right? Always. But the question is, first of all, how many are we talking about? And were you really authentic in getting there? And the city, talks about, their process, and they really want people to be collaborators and to really have say over what happens. And I think that's where you want to go, whether you're on the ladder of participation, where it's like, no, we want to get to the top where we're about power sharing and making a difference, not down here where we're at consulting, or you're on the IAP2, which, talks about it differently, but it's the same thing about how does community have real power and have a say in what they do and how the resources get allocated, because that's a critical question. Because you can say, I want to do this, but if you have any control over how the resources get allocated to do that,
So can we just kind of go back to the community engagement then? So if we're going out to community event rather than them coming to us, what would be an example of an idea?
So the question is, what's an idea for going out to the community for whether they come to us? So I can't take credit for this one because I heard it at the open house for the Upper Harbor, but it was go have an event at the Henry North basketball game. Mm-hmm. Where you have all these people who are coming to the game. You've got a captive audience. Have some food, and do it there. So there's an example.
So like me as an individual.
Well, not you as an individual. Oh, you're asking me an individual.
Yeah.
Okay, so the question was, as an individual, what's an example?
Have a barbecue, have a house party.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you.
Stream it via video every Monday night with your 3 neighbors, like Michelle might be doing.
At Market Creek, one of the things they did is residents would have 2 or 3 people over to their house or on their front porch and have these conversations, and they just continue to do it. So it keeps growing and it gets its own legs. So that's one that you can do, right? Or anybody can do.
Melissa?
Okay.
So, I mean, that land is really interesting because it's north side, but it's so disconnected. Downtown. So, if we could have a downtown extension. When you're talking about this sharing model, do you think that should be kind of every project?
So the question is should power sharing be done in every community, depending on what the communities are, and how do we see this land, the Upper Harbor, given it how disconnected it is, and is it close to downtown? So my first point is that in Southwest, that's a power sharing model. No one in this city would go to Southwest and do what's going on at the Upper Harbor there. So if you think about LRT and going through the park and how all of that got changed because of the uproar about the lake or the whatever it was, right? So clearly, when we look at development and we look at communities, racism is in play, and people who have money and access to power are connected, and they are sharing, and they don't, and it's okay. It's okay for them to be engaged civically and push, and they're not your obstructionists. But all of a sudden, if you're here and you're engaged and you push, oh well, you're not. So you're exercising your civic rights. So I believe that if there's if you're spending my money in the public domain, that we should be involved in charge. Now we know it's America, and landowners have almost unassailable rights. So if that's your property over there and you own it and you're going to build something and it's zoned right, you have the money, there's not a whole lot I can do in that realm. But in something like this or in other things, no, that's not the case. So that was one. What was the other one? Yes, we run the risk of development moving up the river that becomes an extension of downtown because of how it's situated. It's going to take a while because of everything that's there, but given the way it's laid out and the connections, we run that risk. It will be a different community as you get further up because you're not connected. You're not on the central riverfront. But we have the ability of that to be a similar kind of development as it goes all the way up the river. Particularly given it's disconnected.
The cost of it is
Yeah. Well, and
David?
As David said, this is land that was taken from the people who owned it. We have industry and the highway and all that here because the community that didn't have the power to say, no, you can't put this here. And now again, we're saying, okay, we're going to redevelop it. And the first thing you do is you go to the market, and the market is not equitable. I mean, it's just not. It's not equitable. So, and there's not, we would be hard pressed to find across the country a developer of color with the ability to do that kind of project. It would be difficult. People say to me, well, Magic Johnson. Well, yeah, but he's more of this is not like really what he does. If you think Upper Harbor, it's not really what he would do. So it would be tough. It would be tough to find someone who has the ability to do the total, right?
So we're down to our last.
I think Tom has some.
All right, Tom, David, I would like to at 6:30 just segue to the off on screen, and we can keep going for several minutes. Then we have a quick wrap up.
So this is a big, long river that starts in Minnesota, goes to the Gulf of Mexico. This piece here is our piece of the river, our piece of the riverbed. The residents on this side of the river, northeast, they have their piece over there, parkland. There's going to be more parkland. We have our piece here. We're the responsible party. Regardless of a city council or a park board or a foundation or a developer or a music venue, we are the responsible parties. So we need to take our responsibility seriously and work with our fellow residents for a solution.
Amen.
Recap it.
What David said is that this is our part of the river. You know, Mississippi is one of the most significant rivers in the U.S. You know, this piece right here on the north side is ours. And what happens to it and the direction that happens on that site is about the community, and the community needs to take responsibility to ensure that what happens there benefits them best. And that's where we need to go.